students. So welcome you all to another session. So let's begin today's session. So in the previous class, we have started off with the anatomy of the digestive system in case of the frog. So today let's continue with that and let's finish off with the digestive system and then we'll move on to the next system what we have, right? So let's begin with the digestive system or the anatomy of the digestive system in case of frog. So if you remember in the previous session, I just gave you a brief, or we just started off with the frog, right? So we just spoke about the buccal cavity of frog in the previous session, right? And we also spoke about the teeth in case of frog. So quickly going through that. So we have other structures also in the buccal cavity. So we'll quickly look up to those structures which are present in the buccal cavity. Then we'll get into the tubular part of the alimentary canal. So this is what we have seen actually yesterday, right? So this is the upper jaw and the lower jaw. Right, and on the upper jaw, we said that there are the teeth that are being present right on the upper jaw. Right, so this is the teeth that is present on the upper jaw, and we also started calling different names for the teeth, and we gave different definitions also. The first one, quickly writing down those, then we'll proceed further. The first one, we said that the teeth is called the maxillary teeth. Right, maxillary teeth, because the teeth is present only on the maxilla of the upper jawbone. Right. Then we said that the type of dentition shown by these organisms is called homodont dentition. Right, we call it as homodont dentition. So the homodont dentition, homo refers to the same. When we said that there are almost all the teeth are of the same shape and the same type. So therefore we started calling it as the homodont dentition. The third one, what we said was the type of dentition here is called acrodont dentition. So what did we refer to the acrodont dentition? I told you that the teeth are said to be superficially arranged on the jawbone, the upper jawbone. Since the teeth are said to be superficially arranged, such type of dentition we would start calling it as the acrodont dentition. And the last one, what we said was the polyphyodont dentition. The last one, what we said was the polyphyodont dentition. And polyphyodont dentition, I told you that several times the teeth fall off. The reason why several times the teeth fall off is because they are said to be acrodont, because they are said to show acrodont dentition. Since the teeth are said to be superficially arranged on the jawbone, right, there are more chances of the teeth to fall off. So as and when the teeth fall off, or as and when the teeth falls off, new teeth would arise in its place. Such type of dentition we would start calling as the polyphyodont dentition. So this is what we have seen with regards to the teeth of this organism, which is called as the frog. And remember, teeth is present only on the upper jaw and not on the lower jaw. That's the reason why we are calling it as the maxillary teeth. Okay, now let's get into the other structures which are present inside the buccal cavity. Right now, towards the anterior end or towards the maxilla side, there are two small openings which are being present. Right, two small openings. So these openings we start calling them as the internal nares. So in the previous session, when we were talking about the morphology, we said that the head of the cockroach has the external nares or nostrils present towards the tip of the snout. Right. Towards the tip of the snout, they have the nostrils. So that nostrils would open up into the respiratory chamber, what we call it as the nasal chamber. And through the nasal chamber, it would open out through this particular openings, which are called as the internal nares, or we can also start calling it as the internal nostrils. So right below the internal nostrils, there are two bulged structures which are actually present. Right? There are two bulged structures which are being present. So these bulged structures are nothing but the bulges of the eye. So if you remember yesterday again when we were talking about morphology, I told you that in the head region, right, these organisms have one pair of bulged eyes, that is larger eyes, the bulged eyes are being present. So the bulged eyes sockets could be usually observed inside the buccal cavity when the organism opens up its mouth. Now below this bulges of the eye, there is one opening that is being present. Actually, two openings are being present. So we'll just focus on only one opening for now because we are talking about the digestive system. There is one opening that is present, and this opening we will start calling it as the gullet. So gullet is nothing but the opening of the alimentary canal. right? So the opening of the alimentary canal, we would start calling it as gullet. Right next to the gullet or above the gullet, there is one more opening which is called as the glottis. Glottis is nothing but the opening of the respiratory tract. So we are not showing the glottis here. So we will be fine with only the gullet, right? So remember, gullet is nothing but the opening of the alimentary canal. The tubular part of the alimentary canal opens up through this particular structure, which is called as the gullet. Right. Now, towards the posterior end, there is one large muscular structure that is being present. Right. There is a large muscular structure which is actually being present, and that large muscular structure is called as the tongue. Right. So tongue is actually present towards the end, towards the posterior end, where it is said to be a large muscular structure. The tongue is being present. Now, one characteristic feature of the tongue is the tongue here in these organisms. It is attached towards the anterior side, and the posterior side of the tongue is actually said to be free. This you need to remember, right? In case of humans, if you see, the human tongue is attached towards the posterior end of the buccal cavity, right? Through a membranous structure which we call it as the frenulum, right? So towards the posterior end, the tongue is attached to the buccal cavity. But in these organisms, the tongue is actually attached towards the towards the anterior end, and the posterior end of the tongue is actually said to be free. Say if this is the tongue what we are talking about, right? Say if this is the tongue what we are talking about, this is the anterior end and this will be the posterior end. So here towards the anterior end, it is actually said to be attached like this. Such that whenever these organisms has to feed on any insects, what do? They start putting their tongue out. Through the mucus secretions present on the tongue, the insect will stick onto the tongue, and with the help of the tongue, they will start taking in the insects towards the inner part of the buccal cavity. Right? So things what you need to remember here is they have teeth which are present only on the upper jaw, maxillary teeth, and a few things with regards to the teeth what we have actually seen. Homodont dentition, acrodont dentition, and polyphyodont dentition. This is one thing what you need to remember. Second one, there is a pair of internal nostrils present towards the maxilla. Then below that, there is a pair of bulges of the eyes also could be seen. And then there is this gullet which is being present, which is nothing but the opening of the esophagus or the opening of the alimentary canal. We will start calling it as the gullet. Towards the posterior end of the buccal cavity, we have a muscular structure which is present, which is called as the tongue. So characteristic feature of tongue here is the tongue is said to be attached towards the anterior side, and the posterior side of the tongue is said to be free. Whereas in case of humans, it is quite opposite. Posterior end is said to be attached, while the anterior end is actually said to be free. So this is what we have with the buccal cavity of this organism called as the frog. Now, the food that these organisms take in would pass through the mouth. Through the mouth, it would enter into the buccal cavity, and from the buccal cavity, it would pass on into this particular structure called the gullet. Right? So we'll start off the alimentary canal from the gullet part. Right? So this is the gullet, what we are actually talking about. Right? So this is the gullet. Now this gullet opens up into a small tubular structure which is called the esophagus. Right? So this would be the esophagus. Esophagus and pharynx both are actually said to be attached because the neck is actually absent in this region. The pharynx would be very, very small, and most of the cases we show it attached to that of the esophagus itself. Now, this esophagus would open up into a large tubular sac-like structure which is called the stomach. So there is this stomach which would actually come up. Right? So this would be the stomach. So it is a large tubular structure which is called as the stomach. Now this stomach will start secreting some sort of gastric juices which would contain HCl as well as the other enzymes such as pepsinogen, inactive form of pepsin. All those enzymes are being secreted by the stomach. The process of digestion usually begins here in the stomach. One more characteristic feature I forgot to tell you. In the buccal cavity itself, you can make a note of it. The entire buccal cavity, so this we started calling it as the buccal cavity. Right, so this entire structure is the buccal cavity. Inside the buccal cavity, there are mucus glands which are present. Right, so mucus glands are actually present inside the buccal cavity, and we know what is the function of mucus glands. Mucus glands are the ones which are responsible for secretion of mucus. Right, and through the secretion of mucus, the entire buccal cavity actually remains moist. right? The moistness of the buccal cavity is because of the secretion of mucus from the mucus gland. One more very important thing what you need to remember here is these organisms do not have salivary glands. So there are no salivary glands opening up into the buccal cavity. So since there is no salivary glands being present, the process of digestion does not take place in the buccal cavity. Rather, the process of digestion actually begins here in this tubular structure, tubular sac-like structure, which is called as the stomach. Okay, right. So in the stomach, the process of digestion actually begins upon the secretion of the enzymes which bring about the process of digestion. Right. Now, this tubular stomach now opens up into the next part, and the tubular structure would now open up into the next part, which is a straightened tubular structure, which is the small intestine. So the small intestine is characterized by two different structures. One is called the duodenum, and the other one is called the ileum. Right. So as we have already discussed yesterday, as I've already mentioned yesterday, that frogs are said to be carnivorous organisms. Right. And you remember yesterday I told you that if an organism is carnivore, the alimentary canal would actually be shorter. Right. Carnivores would have a shorter alimentary canal, especially with regards to the small intestine. So if an organism is a carnivore, definitely the alimentary canal would be shorter, because there is no cellulose digestion happening. So if cellulose digestion has to take place, the alimentary canal would be longer, as seen in case of herbivores. Right. So here in these organisms, since frogs are said to be carnivorous organisms, they have a shorter alimentary canal. That is, they have a shorter small intestine present. Now, this small intestine is characterized by two parts. First part is called as the duodenum. This, what we have done here, would be the duodenum. The first part is called the duodenum, right? And this duodenum is a straight part where it is not a coiled structure. So this is the duodenum that is being present. So maximum part of digestion actually takes place in the duodenum only, right? And into the duodenum, there are other glands also which are opening. So we'll take up with those glands also a little later. Now this duodenum opens up into another coiled structure, right? It would open up into another coiled structure. And this coiled structure would be called as the ileum, right? So this would be the ileum. And both of these together, we would start calling it as the small intestine, right? So the duodenum and ileum together, we would start calling it as the small intestine. And again, remember, duodenum is a small part, which is a straight tubular structure, while ileum is the longer part of this small intestine, and it is said to be a coiled structure. Right. So the process of digestion, complete digestion takes place in the duodenum, and the process of absorption usually takes place in the ileum part. So in the duodenum, there are these digestive glands which are being present, which would start secreting the intestinal juices. And along with that, in the ileum, they are characterized by the presence of the villi and microvilli, which would start increasing the surface area for the process of absorption of the digested food. Right. So this two together constitutes the small intestine. Now, small intestine opens up into the large intestine, and the large intestine is characterized by only one part, which is a dilated structure, right? It is only one part, so it is a dilated structure, and that dilated structure was called as the rectum. So this would be the rectum, and this rectum would constitute the large intestine. So the large intestine is characterized by the presence of this structure, which is called as the rectum, right? And the rectum would open to the outside through this opening that is present, which is called as the cloaca. Remember, yesterday also we were talking about cloaca when we were talking about morphology, right? I told you one of the characteristic features of these organisms is presence of this opening towards the posterior end, which is called as the cloaca, right? So cloaca, I told you, it is a common opening for three different systems. One is this digestive system, where all the undigested food, after the process of digestion gets completed in the duodenum, the process of absorption gets completed in the ileum. Whatever undigested food is still there in the alimentary canal will be passed on into the rectum. And from the rectum, all of the undigested food will now be sent out of the body through this particular opening towards the posterior end, which is called as the rectum. And along with that, into the rectum through the cloaca. Along with this, into the rectum, there are two more systems also opening. One is the excretory system, and the second one is the reproductive system. So the excretory as well as the reproductive system both again open up into the rectum, and through the cloaca itself, the excretory waste, that is the nitrogenous waste, as well as the gametes are also being released to the outside. So we'll talk about that a little later once we take up the next systems here. Now this entire thing constitutes the alimentary canal of this particular organism. So the alimentary canal of frog, it includes the gullet, the esophagus, stomach, the duodenum, ileum, the rectum, as well as the cloaca. So two separate openings. First opening is the mouth and the second opening is the cloaca. Therefore, we would start calling such type of digestive system as an organisms having the complete alimentary canal. Right. Now, along with this, as I've already said, in the process of digestion, there are some glands also involved. So two major glands are involved in the process of digestion. One is the liver and the other one is pancreas. Liver and pancreas together, they form a common duct, and that common duct will be opened up into the duodenum. So let us see how exactly it is opening up. So here there would be this common duct which would actually arise. Right. So here would be the common duct. Right. And this common duct has two openings here. Right. The first opening would be the opening of the pancreas. So here. So this would be the pancreas that is being present here. So pancreas would start giving out the pancreatic juices, right? And all of that pancreatic juice will now be passed on through the pancreatic duct. And from the pancreatic duct, it will be passed on through this common opening through which it is actually being poured into the duodenum part of the small intestine. Then towards the other side, there is this larger structure which is present, and this larger structure is called as the liver. So here there will be the liver here, so the largest gland that is present, right? So it is a bilobe structure, right? So a larger gland which is a bilobe structure, and here there would be another additional organ which is said to be attached to it, which would be called as the gallbladder. And from here we would have the gut, the duct actually coming up from here, right? So we will have this duct coming up from here, right? So this is how it appears to be. So this would be the organ which is liver, the gland which is called as the liver, and this one here would be the gallbladder. The gallbladder, right? So the liver and the gallbladder will start secreting out the bile juice. So the bile from the liver and the gallbladder will now be poured on into this duct, which would carry the bile, and it would open up into the common duct that is present here. Right? So it would open up into this common duct that is present. So this duct is referred to as the hepatopancreatic duct. So it is referred to as the hepatopancreatic duct. Right? So the bile juice from the liver and the gallbladder, as well as the pancreatic juice from the pancreas, would pass through the common hepatopancreatic duct. And once they pass through the common hepatopancreatic duct, all of that juices is actually poured into the duodenum, where the process of complete digestion happens. Right? So this is what we have with the complete alimentary canal as well as the digestive gland of these organs. Now, one important thing we need to remember: there is no salivary glands present. Right? So because salivary glands also is a major part of the digestive system in several higher organisms, including humans. In these organisms, salivary glands are said to be absent. They have only two glands, that is the liver as well as the pancreas, which are completely involved in the process of digestion. Right? So this is what we have with the digestive system of this organism, which is called as the frog. So the anatomy of the digestive system in case of frog. Right? So once we have done with the anatomy of the digestive system, let us now take up with the next system what we have in the list, which is called as the respiratory system. Right? So talking about respiratory system, we usually don't give the term respiratory system when we are talking about the frog, because there are several organs involved in the process of respiration in these organisms. Right? So let us quickly look at what are the different organs which are involved in the process of respiration in these organisms, and we'll see when this organism or when the frog uses those organs for bringing about the process of respiration. So I'm just simply mentioning it as the process of respiration. now talking about respiration, as I've already mentioned, there are different organs involved in the process of respiration in this organs, right? Different organs. So let us quickly go through what are those organs and let us see when these organisms will start using those organs. The first respiratory organ seen in case of frogs is the gills. Right, so they will start using gills. So we are very much sure about the gills, right? So gills are nothing but the predominant respiratory organs in case of aquatic organisms, right? So in case of frog also, these structures called gills are involved in the process of respiration. Now during their lifetime, one part of their lifetime or their life cycle, they would start using gills for the process of respiration. When do they use gills? Gills are used in the larval stages. Right? So during the larval stages, gills are said to be the predominant respiratory organs in case of frog. So the tadpole larva, we know that the tadpole larva is actually said to be aquatic. So if you remember yesterday also we were talking about that, right? So I told you amphibians are those organisms which are dependent on water for the process of reproduction. So what does that mean? Adult organisms, they enter into the water and there they would start undergoing the process of reproduction. So what does that mean? Again, the young organisms are actually released into the water. That means the larval stage is also said to be present in the water. So since they are present in water, gills are the most appropriate respiratory organs for any organisms that live in water. Right. So here also, that is the reason why the larvae have gills which are involved in the process of respiration. Now again, remember, gills are nothing but very thin membranous structure which is involved in the process of exchange of gases. Right. So through these thin membranous structures called as gills, the process of respiration, that is exchange of gases, takes place in the larval stage. That is nothing but the tadpole larva. So this is the first organ that is involved in the process of respiration. The second structure involved in the process of respiration is the skin. Right. So if skin, again, one more thing. If gills are the respiratory organs, we would start calling such type of respiration as the branchial respiration. Right, so we will start calling it as the branchial respiration. So if gills are the respiratory organ, we will start calling it as branchial respiration. So this sort of branchial respiration is actually seen in the larval stage. Second organ is the skin. So after the adult is being formed, after the process of metamorphosis, development, all that, once an adult organism is formed, these adult organisms will no longer start utilizing gills or start using gills for the process of respiration. They start shifting on to other organs for the process of exchange of gases. And one such organ is the skin. Now, if skin is the respiratory organ, such type of respiration, we will start calling it as cutaneous respiration. Right? So, if skin is the respiratory organ, we will start calling it as the cutaneous respiration. Right? Now, if any organ has to act as an ideal respiratory surface, right, try to understand this carefully. If any organ has to act as an ideal respiratory surface, they have to follow certain conditions or they have to have certain criteria. So what are those criteria? Number one, if any organ has to act as a respiratory surface, that surface has to be very thin. Very thin. So only if the surface is said to be thin, the diffusion of gases will occur at a faster rate. That is the reason why even in case of humans also, we know that the respiratory surface in case of humans is nothing but alveoli. And we have already studied about this when we were talking about animal tissues, right? So the cells which line the alveoli, they are nothing but simple squamous epithelial tissues, which are nothing but a single layer of flattened cells which would favor the process of diffusion. That's how the membrane of the alveoli or the lining of the alveoli is said to be very, very thin. So here also, if skin has to act as a respiratory surface, the skin has to be very, very thin. That is the first criteria for not only skin, any other organ to act as an ideal respiratory surface. The second thing, for acting as an ideal respiratory surface, that particular surface should always be moist. It should always be moist, because we know that the diffusion of gases usually does not occur simply like that. What happens, all the gases which are actually entering into our body, they would actually get diffused or they would get dissolved in the moistness that is present. Right? Even in our alveoli, we have the mucus secretions. Right. So through in the mucus, the gases will be dissolved, and or from the mucus, the dissolved oxygen will now get diffused into the cell. So here also the same thing that we have already studied yesterday, right? When we were talking about morphology, I told you that the skin of this organism is always kept moist because of the mucus secretion. One reason why it is always kept moist is because it is acting as an ideal respiratory surface. So it is always kept moist. The third thing is this structure always has to be highly vascular. It is said to be high, it has to be highly vascular. Now, when we say it has to be highly vascular, so what does that mean? There should be more of blood vessels and more of blood supply to that particular region. Again, why more of blood vessels and why more of blood supply? Because we know that the structure or the substance which is involved in the transportation of gases are nothing but blood. So whatever oxygen gets into the body, it will get dissolved in the blood, or it would get accommodated by the hemoglobin, and through the blood it is being transported to different parts of the body. So if more of blood is available at that particular site where there is exchange of gases happening, more amount of gases can be transported to different parts of the body. So it has to be highly vascular. And the last one is it has to have a large surface area. So the surface area should be large. So only if the surface area is large, more amount of oxygen will be able to diffuse into the system, and then it will act as it will start acting as a what we can say as a ideal respiratory surface. So for any respiratory surface to act as an ideal respiratory surface, all these four conditions has to be followed. One is it should be thin, it should be moist, it should be highly vascular, and it should have a large surface area. Only then we would start calling it as an ideal respiratory surface. So the skin of frog satisfies all of these conditions, as a result of which they would start undergoing the cutaneous respiration. So if you just start comparing this with the human skin, right? So human skin is thin, here itself it is what human skin is said to be very, very thick. The reason why human skin is said to be thick is because it is composed of stratified epithelium, right? We have already studied about this, right? It is composed of keratinized squamous epithelium, stratified keratinized squamous epithelial tissue, where it appears to be very, very thick. And that is the reason why human skin does not act as an ideal respiratory surface. Okay, so here in case of these organisms, skin would start acting as an ideal respiratory surface because of these conditions. Now, when do these organisms use skin as the respiratory surface? When do these organisms use skin as the respiratory organ? Two conditions where these organisms use skin as the respiratory surface. Number one, the first one, when the organism is in water. When the organism is in water, the mode of respiration is said to be cutaneous respiration. This is one thing, right? So whenever, and remember, we are talking about the adult organism. Larval stage in water, they would use branchial respiration, or they would undergo branchial respiration. Adult organism, once they get into water, they would start undergoing cutaneous respiration. This is one phase where they would start undergoing cutaneous respiration. Second, whenever these organisms undergo the process of estivation, whenever they undergo estivation and hibernation. So during estivation and hibernation, that is during the summer sleep and winter sleep respectively, they would start using this cutaneous respiration. So these things you need to remember. When do they use different organs for the process of respiration, right? So this is what we have, the cutaneous respiration. The second organ which is utilized by these organisms for the process of respiration. Now moving on to the third structure. The third structure, what they use is something called as the buccopharyngeal cavity. Right? So they will start using the buccopharyngeal cavity as the third structure for the process of respiration. Now, what exactly is this buccopharyngeal cavity? The cavity that is present joining the buccal cavity as well as the pharynx region. Right. So if the buccopharyngeal cavity is involved in the process of respiration, we would start calling such type of respiration as the buccopharyngeal respiration. Right. It is referred to as the buccopharyngeal respiration. So such type of respiration is referred to as the buccopharyngeal respiration. Now, lining the buccal cavity also, there is a thin membrane that is present, which is the mucous membrane. So a thin mucous membrane is present, which lines the buccopharyngeal cavity, and as it is also said to be highly vascular. highly vascular. So because of these reasons, it would start acting as an ideal respiratory surface in these organisms. Now, when do these organisms use buccopharyngeal respiration? When the organism is in, or when the organism is on land, right? So when the organism is on land, they would start using this buccopharyngeal respiration. So how they are using it, we'll see it in a few moments from now once we take up with the next type of structure. And we'll see when do they use this buccopharyngeal respiration. The fourth type of respiratory structure, is the lungs. The fourth type of respiratory structure is the lungs. And we know that if lungs are the respiratory organs, we would start calling such type of respiration as the pulmonary respiration. Right? So we will start calling it as the pulmonary respiration. Now this pulmonary respiration, so if you just see the structure of the lungs, how exactly it appears is, as I've already said, in the buccal cavity, there are two openings I told you, right? One is the opening of the alimentary canal, which we call it as the gullet. And the second opening is the opening of the respiratory tract, which is called as the glottis. So here, this is how the glottis actually appears to be, right? So this would be the glottis. Now this glottis branches or divides into two branches, right? It will divide into two branches. And these branches, we will start calling them as the bronchi. Now, these bronchi will start opening up into these oval sac-like structures, and these oval sac-like structures are the ones which are called as the lungs. So, oval sac-like structures are the lungs that we build. So, this is how the lungs are actually being present. Now, if you just look at inside the lungs, how exactly it is present. So, inside the lungs, there are certain sac-like structures which are being present. Right? So these sac-like structures are present throughout the lungs, and these sac-like structures are called as the alveoli. And in the alveoli, there is exchange of gases actually taking place. And alveoli follows all of these four characteristic features. Right? Alveoli is said to be thin, it is said to be moist because of the mucus secretion, it is said to be highly vascular, and it also has a larger surface area. Yeah, so this is what we have in the pulmonary respiration. Now, when do these organisms again undergo pulmonary respiration? Again, when these organisms are on land. Right, so when these organisms are on land, they would again undergo this mode of respiration called the pulmonary respiration. Right, so on land, these organisms use two organs. One is the buccopharyngeal cavity, and the other one is the lungs. So when do these organisms use buccopharyngeal respiration, and when do they undergo pulmonary respiration? Let us quickly see when they use this buccopharyngeal cavity for the process of exchange of gases, as well as when do they use lungs for the process of exchange of gases. So let us quickly look up to that. So if we have to understand that, let us take up with this. Say this is the organism, right? The body of the organism, the head of the organism, what we have. Right. So here we are not drawing the entire structure, the head would be sufficient. This would be the nostril, what we are actually talking about, the external nostrils, through which the air would start entering into the buccal cavity, and from the buccal cavity it would enter into the glottis, from the glottis into the bronchi, and then into the lungs. In the lungs, they would enter into the alveoli. Inside the alveoli, there would be exchange of gases actually happening. Right. Now, if we have to draw the same structure here, right? So here the glottis would be present. Right? And here there would be this particular lung that is present. So since it is a lateral view, we'll be able to show only one lung, and the other lung would actually be somewhere this side. The other lung would be that side. Now what you need to remember here is there are two openings for the air to enter into the lungs. One is the external nostrils, second one is the glottis. So this would be the glottis, right? And this would be the external nostril. So there are two openings for the air to enter into the lungs. First, it should pass through the external nostrils, and then it should enter into the glottis. What exactly happens here is both these openings do not remain open at the same time. So this you have to fix up in your mind. Right? So external nostrils and the glottis, they do not open at the same time. If external nostril is open, the glottis would be closed. If the external nostril is closed, the glottis would be open. Okay? Right. So what exactly happens? First instance, external nostril is open, the glottis remains closed. Now what would happen? All the air from the outside will pass through the glottis, pass through the external nostril because the external nostril is open. Now, since the glottis is closed, what would happen? The air will not be able to enter into the lungs. So what would happen? All the air will get accumulated here in this particular region. Right? As a result of which, this entire part will start becoming somewhat swollen. Right? So this is actually considered to be the pharynx region that is present. So during this time, these organisms will actually start undergoing buccopharyngeal respiration. Okay? Right? So what exactly is happening? When the external nostrils are open, the glottis is said to be closed. As a result of which, the air is able to enter into the buccal cavity or the pharynx region, but it is not able to enter inside the glottis because the glottis is said to be closed. So at that point of time, the air would get accumulated in the pharyngeal region, as a result of which the pharynx region will be swollen. You can just observe that, right? If you try to find a frog, you can just observe that in the neck region, they don't have a neck, but in the pharyngeal region, you find a swollen structure. And that is because of the accumulation of air during the process of respiration, because the glottis is said to be closed. And this is the time they would start undergoing this buccopharyngeal respiration. This is the first instance. The second instance now, what happens? Second instance, what happens is the external nostrils would close. Once the external nostrils close, the glottis will now open. Once the glottis opens, whatever air is now present in the buccal region or the pharyngeal region will now start entering into the lungs, where they would now start undergoing this pulmonary respiration. So that's how. So alternatively, there is this buccopharyngeal respiration as well as pulmonary respiration happening in these organisms, as long as these organisms are in or on land. So what exactly is happening is, so this is how things is happening. So things what you need to remember here. Whenever the external nostrils open, the glottis is closed. At that point of time, buccopharyngeal respiration occurs, right? Making it very simple. Whenever external nostrils are open, glottis is closed. At that time, buccopharyngeal respiration happens. Second instance, whenever external nostrils close and the glottis open, that is the time pulmonary respiration happens, right? So you need to remember these two terms. When exactly buccopharyngeal respiration takes place, when exactly the pulmonary respiration takes place. Again, I'm just repeating it once again. When the external nostrils open and the glottis closes, that is the time buccopharyngeal respiration takes place. When the external nostrils close and the glottis opens, that is the time where the pulmonary respiration actually takes place. Yeah. So this is what we have in the different organs which are involved in the process of respiration, right? So here we have seen 4 different organs involved in the process of respiration. One is gills. Gills, that is nothing but branchial respiration. So they would undergo branchial respiration only in the larval stages, right? Because the larvae is said to be aquatic forms. Second one, in the adult organism, they use these 3 different organs for the process of respiration. It could be either cutaneous respiration or buccopharyngeal respiration or pulmonary respiration. Cutaneous respiration is seen only when the organism enters into the water. Again, remember, the adult organism entering into the water. And along with that, during the process of estivation and hibernation also, the type of respiration taking place here in these organisms is cutaneous respiration. When the organism is on land, mostly it would be buccopharyngeal respiration as well as pulmonary respiration, which takes place in an alternative manner. So when the external nostrils open, glottis close, buccopharyngeal respiration. When the external nostrils close, glottis opens, the pulmonary respiration. Right? So since there are different organs involved in the process of respiration, we have just written down as the respiration rather than talking about the respiratory system. Right? So with this, we are done with another topic under the anatomy of frog, which is the respiratory system. Right? So in the next session, let's take up with the next topic, which is called as the circulatory system in case of this organism. Right? Thank you.